Hi, welcome to the first lesson that goes along with period 6. This is titled from chapters 15, A Harvest of Blood, Native Peoples Dispossessed. And it aligns with the key concepts that refer to the removal. During the Civil War, as Americans were distracted by the war in the Western theater, out in the American Midwest and what will become the state of Minnesota, the United States comes into conflict with the Dakota Sioux. The Dakota Sioux eventually, feeling like they are being taken advantage of, will march on their way to St. Paul, where they intend to wipe out the white settlers, will be stopped eventually. But in response to that, Americans will get in an uproar, and a young U.S. general named Chivington will take out the anger of all Americans on the Cheyenne tribe, which are allied with the Dakota Sioux, resulting in the Sand Creek Massacre. That will be followed up with the Fetterman Massacre, where Chief Red Cloud will attempt unsuccessfully to fight a big war, but eventually settle on creating some standards for white settlement in the area. So it's a brief victory for the natives here in the period during the Civil War. So, in the midst of all this, President Grant will, as he's trying to deal with Reconstruction, will actually completely shift gears. Frustrated by the violence of the Fetterman Massacre and the settlement with Red Cloud, he will adopt what's called the peace policy, and he'll invite into his cabinet a series of people called reformers, who actually believe quite radically that natives themselves are civilized and that we don't actually have an Indian problem, we have a white person problem. And so rather than try to wipe out natives, we're going to try to work with them, Christianize them, and generally try to get along with them. So one of the key features of Grant's reform policy or peace policy was the creation of Indian boarding schools, the most famous of which was the Carlisle Indian School, where essentially native children were taken and separated away from their families and sent to white people's school, where English was the required subject. They were taught manners, they were taught proper Western or white behavior, generally all intended to civilize them. And the photos provided here show the same three children first dressed in traditional native Lakota gear, and then what they look like in the boarding schools. So while this might seem to have fairly innocent intentions, in reality this was very upsetting and very disjointing to native peoples. The reform policy of Grant had lots of hurdles. Natives themselves had been removed from their land. They were suffering in poverty. The federal government had abolished its treaty-making procedure officially in 1869. The House and the Senate said no more treaty-making, effectively treating the natives not like independent nations anymore. And in the midst of all of these efforts to deal with natives legally, the Supreme Court in 1903 in Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock rules that the U.S. government can make whatever Indian policy it wants, regardless of whatever treaties may or may not have existed in the past. This is pretty damaging to native rights. A few years later, in Ex parte Crow Dog, the same year, the court officially ruled that native peoples, although they're not separate nations because they're not being treated with treaties, are not in fact U.S. citizens and can only be granted citizenship officially by Congress, despite the contents of the 14th Amendment, which would imply, as native-born people, that they are in fact citizens. So, as part of the peace policy, or shortly after it, in 1887, Henry Dawes of Massachusetts comes up with this idea that he's going to call the Dawes Severalty Act. Severalty is just a fancy word for breaking up of large lands into smaller lands. So his vision was that if we take tribal lands and we break them up into small homestead-sized things, like white homesteads, that Native American people will become white people through a personal sense of independence and sort of taking them away from the grand tribal structure. This is an absolute disaster, both in implementation and in long-term consequences. white speculators will take advantage of the rules lands and declare that lots of surplus land exists. The Bureau of Indian Affairs will seize that land, hundreds of millions of acres of land taken away from natives, purely on the idea that this is excess land after you split up the homesteads and divide it by the number of people in the tribe. It will result in Oklahoma being the final Indian territory that becomes settled by Westerners. So, in the midst of all of this peace policy of Grant, lots of Americans were really confident that we were solving the Indian problem. In 1876, as more and more people all these native people are moving into the reservations created by the Severalty Act. The Lakota Sioux were the last band to really refuse to move onto reservations, led by Sitting Bull. He would often cross into Canada to avoid capture and then return, but ultimately refused to accommodate the white people's desire to move them onto reservations. That Depression of 1873, in the midst of that, we discover gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which was the land that we had secured as property of the Sioux in the 1868 treaty. Well, now there's gold. The U.S. government encourages the Sioux to sell that land. They refuse. The U.S. sends in the cavalry to remove them. And this is the famous last stand at the Little Battle of Little Bighorn, where General Custer is killed and his entire battalion of cavalry are wiped out by Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux, which is essentially the last native victory over white soldiers during this period. The years that will follow this, we'll see one by one all of the great tribal leaders go on to reservations and surrender to whites. So, as natives are struggling here to survive, many of them will start to take a greater role in their own teaching of their children. So you start to see the efforts of white Americans, like boarding schools and forced education, to start to adapt so that Indians had a greater voice in those things. For example, boarding schools often moved from isolated regions onto reservations, and teachers had to sort of deal with the fact that natives were going to have a greater voice in the education of their children. Lots of success stories emerge from this. Several Native Americans, like Dr. George Eastman, will adopt many of the ways of whites, will become a successful doctor, work alongside white surgeons. Natives will encourage their children to learn the ways of the white man, while also preserving many of the traditions of their tribe, whatever tribe that is. We talk about cultural syncretism or synchronization. So as we have the adoption of Western ways with native ways combining, we have sort of a unique blend of a new culture. And nothing exemplifies that more than the ghost dance movement of the 1880s and 1890s. A group of natives came to believe and preach that if through the adoption of this religiously symbolic ritual called the ghost dance, they could bring back the bisons and drive out the white man. This ultimately results in a misunderstanding by whites that this was some sort of a violent movement. And once again, in 1890, they will sweep in, and what will become the Wounded Knee Massacre will murder women and children of the Lakota Sioux in an effort to crush. So, in closing, really, one of the things that people have to grapple with when talking about the settlement of the West is what was real and what was just myth. One of the great myth makers of this era is Buffalo Bill Cody, who created essentially a traveling Wild West show, like a traveling circus show, where he retold the story of the conquest of the West. And he didn't just include white actors. He also included Sitting Bull worked for a time on his traveling show. But essentially, we have this idea of the gallivanting cowboy, that this heroic individual, rugged individual that fought against the savagery of the native. It's really not that story at all, but that's the story that in the 1950s and 60s we'll capture with the American Western, the spaghetti Western, and the John Wayne Western of Hollywood. It will go back and recapture that idea of Buffalo Bill Cody's West. The last thing that's important really here is that in the same time frame, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner will write his Frontier Thesis, in which he argued that, looking at the census data in 1890, that the West was officially closed, and this was the last of the frontiers. And that was going to change the shape of who we were as Americans, because for generations, we had always had sort of an outlet to go to. When things got too congested, we could always move to the next open space. And so this Frontier Thesis argued that Americans had shaped their identity by always having an opportunity to remake themselves with a fresh start. But after 1890, that was not going to be the case anymore. Other historians have come back and countered that and tried to delegitimize Turner, but Turner's Frontier Thesis is ultimately something that's really important to take away. As we talk about takeaways, what are the great takeaways of this section? I think it's important to understand that in the process of trying to manage Native Americans, the U.S. government will alter its treaty-making policy to one where we no longer treat Natives as separate nations, but we also don't treat them as citizens of the United States. And the courts support that through cases like Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock. Additionally, you should understand the reality versus the myth of the American West and the settlement and the conflict with Native Americans. The role that the Dawes Severalty Act plays and Grant's peace policy plays in the changing relationship between whites and Native Americans during this time period. And lastly, I would close with a big takeaway that's in the key concepts is this idea of the Frontier Thesis and what that means to Americans and our settlement of the West.